This is Gender in Focus. I'm Elle, and each week I sit down with the president of Transfocus Consulting and all-round gender diversity genius, Kai Scott. I get to ask all the questions you've ever wanted to ask about how to make the workplace and the world a better place for trans and non-binary people. Let's get into it.
In today's episode, we're talking about how to distinguish respectful from invasive curiosity. Sure, we want to know more about gender diversity, but not all questions of trans and non-binary people are created equal. Let's unpack this in more detail in today's episode.
So I imagine that you've been on the receiving end of some interesting questions, Kai.
Yes.
And I wanted to start with asking that where is the line between being curious and wanting to learn more about you and your experience and about trans experience in general, and being nosy and just prying straight in?
Absolutely. So true about being nosy. But I appreciate why people want to know more, because unfortunately in our society, we haven't learned about, talked about, just known about trans and non-binary folks. It's only become visible to the general population in very recent years. So people feel a pressure and an anxiety to want to understand. So I want to acknowledge that's coming from a good place. But unfortunately, it can blind people to what they're doing, and can overemphasize getting information from one person in front of them, usually because we only meet maybe 1, 2, 3, or a few trans and non-binary folks in our lives. And so that kind of overemphasizes and puts this laser focus on this one person. And they're just trying to go about their lives, right? And so really the fine line between asking genuine questions, respectful questions, and invasive questions is what you expect from that person. So if you feel owed an explanation or information from an individual, then that tells you that you're tipping towards the more invasive side of questions. Another factor is how personal or private this information is. Typically, the test for that is, would you ask a person who is not trans or who is cisgender the same question? That'll often give you some information. And so these kind of multiple factors can help you understand, am I on one side or the other of this spectrum? And I appreciate that people want to be on the genuine, respectful question side. And really, it's about seeing and asking even, hey, is it okay if I ask you about X, Y, and Z before launching into the question? That gives people a time and a moment to be like, actually, today I don't want to talk about that. Or, sure, yeah, I'm open to talking about it. So it's being responsive and kind of attuned to the trans and non-binary person and where they're at with wanting to answer questions.
How do you balance that if you're really curious about something and you want to be respectful, but you also want you really want to know the answer to something?
Absolutely.
How do you balance that?
Yeah. And I think it's good that people want to know information and want to know more about trans and non-binary folks. Now, I'll say that you don't need to have the focused only on the trans and non-binary person in front of you. There's actually so many other great resources and places where people can get that information. So maybe the trans person isn't up for answering that question, or you've assessed and determined that the question you're wanting to ask is actually a little too personal. If you think about in the workplace, we probably don't want to be asking about people's surgeries or medical procedures. We would extend that same courtesy to even a cisgender person. We wouldn't ask about surgeries that they're undertaking. And so where do you get that information? Well, there's actually plenty of folks on, say, YouTube or podcasts or even articles that people can access to get that information. On YouTube, there's tons of trans and non-binary folks who are have chosen to share their stories. And some of them also, the kind of surgeries and procedures that they're deciding to undertake, they bring people along on that journey. So you don't just have to rely on the one person that you know, or maybe more, but you can go to other sources. Other places are 2S, that's the LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender communities and organizations. Say, for example, Egal Canada have great resources that you can download and read. Certainly, Transfocus has our own set as well to help people be allies and to help have better understanding on the issues. So, again, you can ask questions, but it's just being mindful and aligning up with the trans or non-binary person's desire to share or not. And if not, then you have other places you can go.
What would count as an inappropriate question?
Mm-hmm. So I'll give you an example from my own story, and this is very much aligned with other trans and non-binary folks. Very, especially in early stages of coming out to folks, people are very curious about gender-affirming care, in particular surgeries. So I had a very common question of, have you had the surgery? And I emphasize the because unfortunately there's not just one procedure, or maybe fortunately that there's many different types of options available to folks, and that everyone makes the choices that are right for them, and not everybody accesses that type of care either. So we want to be very careful about kind of presuming that people will access that care, or that they ought to. Some people misunderstand that trans people, they think they ought to transition medically, but that's not always the case. And so one question can have so many things kind of baked into it, misunderstandings, fairly invasive because it's a very personal matter. Everybody makes choices and have to weigh many different factors. And even they may be excited to have surgery, there might still be a lot that's kind of baked into it that makes it really difficult. For example, in Canada, we have long wait times, so anywhere from 2 years to 5 years to access care. That can really weigh on somebody as they're waiting for that really important affirming care. So it's just not wading into that very personal, very private space for folks, especially within the workplace. Another example, if people who use they them pronouns, is, why do you use they them pronouns? When did you know that you're a non-binary? Just like really kind of pummeling them with rapid fire questions, and that can really put somebody out of sorts and be kind of back away from that interaction, where they're almost having to kind of justify their existence rather than just being able to be without it having been such a big deal. Another invasive question is, say, expectations around how somebody should appear for their gender or how they should look. So if somebody has said that they're a man and then dresses, say, in a more feminine way, people may say, "Why do you dress in that way? That doesn't make any sense. You said you were a man." And so people can have these kind of invasive questions and almost kind of interrogating their gender based on their presentation, realizing or not recognizing that gender identity is separate from how someone expresses themselves or their gender expression.
And would you say that that's true across all settings? What you've said is an inappropriate question. Is that true everywhere?
Mm. Like in terms of gender identity different from gender expression, or all the
Or just
examples?
any invasive question that you've considered? Yeah, is
Right.
that true everywhere?
Yeah, it's a good one, especially when we think about gender affirming care and people's access choices around it. Certainly, generally good to steer clear of that question within a workplace context for understandable reasons that it's very personal and private. But maybe within a family context, it might be suitable to inquire in a caring sort of way, and also from a logistical standpoint, like, does this person need after surgery care that maybe a family member or a friend could provide? So it's the orientation with which you ask the question. Is it that you're trying to kind of extract something from someone or provide something to them, right? So if you have the orientation of, I want to help you, and I just inquiring if there is something that I should be aware of, that's a really good intention and orientation of that question. And that can be very valuable within a personal setting or personal relationship with that person.
If you're at work and you happen to have a close relationship with a trans person at work, often what can happen is people will maybe not direct the question at the trans person, but they will then direct the question at a person close to them.
Yeah.
How does, well, actually, I have two questions with that. Firstly, how should the person respond when being asked these invasive questions about somebody else, especially if that person isn't present?
Yeah.
And then, second of all, if you are that person asking that question, what's the best way to go about handling kind of the questions that you have?
Yes, that's a really important consideration, because sometimes people realize, oh, I shouldn't ask the trans person. They realize how awkward that is, but there's still this, the bubbling curiosity is too strong, or people kind of feel entitled to a response. And so they will go to somebody else, kind of a backdoor response, to go to somebody that's close to the trans person and pummel them with a bunch of questions, which can create a really awkward situation for that employee who is close to the trans person. And speaking about from their perspective, I would encourage them to redirect the person asking the question and be like, that's not my story to tell. That's inappropriate of me to respond. That's very personal information. You may not realize it, and it's okay. It's not like you had bad intentions, but I won't be responding to those questions. You can be quite firm in a supportive and, understanding way for people, because sometimes people don't realize just how invasive their questions are until somebody just declines to respond. And that could be a really important learning moment that you offer to that person. It's not rude because they're unfortunately not thinking it through entirely, and that it's not appropriate to kind of get information from somebody not directly from the trans person. And so that's one way of responding and handling that situation. Another thing, thinking about it from the perspective of the person who asked the question, is I always encourage folks just to pause before they ask a question. Do I need to know this information? Is this like necessary for the work at hand? Is there another place I can ask or get this information, right? To kind of, I know it's very curiosity can be a very strong force, but just to be with that discomfort of not knowing right away, but that eventually you will know and have that information. Really, what's critical in the workplace is quite simple. It's just knowing somebody's first name and their pronouns. You can even just get by with somebody's first name. All the other details, if you get close to somebody, maybe you'll be privy to that information, but otherwise it's actually not necessary. Sometimes people have this like, I need to know in order to respect type of configuration in their mind, an equation, when actually it's much, much more simple than that, which is a good thing. We don't want it to be super complex. And hopefully that takes away some of that anxiety, and that, there are other avenues for getting that information from a curiosity standpoint. So hopefully that's helpful. But I definitely can relate to the question about close people who are close to trans folks getting those types of questions, and that also, even though people think they're not harming a trans person, can put that person in an awkward position, and it's okay to push back on that.
We've had a previous episode talking about dealing with mistakes. And I was really wanting to ask the question about, let's say you've asked an invasive question and you didn't mean to, you were just curious, you've asked a question,
Yeah.
it's been made clear to you that it's an inappropriate question. How do you respond to that? Like, what would be the best way to clean up that mess a bit.
Absolutely. And hey, that might happen, in which case, I mean, thank goodness that person mentioned something, in which case you can come from a place of, or one could come from a place of gratitude. Just be like, thank you for mentioning that. I totally understand that either it's to the trans person themselves or somebody close to them who has put up a firm boundary. Just say, yeah, now that you mention it, I can see why you wouldn't want to respond to that question. And in saying that, that actually helps establish trust with that. Some people want to kind of skip past that and be like, oh, I hope they didn't notice, or I'm embarrassed. But really to be kind of matter of fact about that, apologizing and understanding can help them realize, okay, they get it and they're not being dismissive. Because some people, if people put up a firm boundary around questions, they'll push back and be like, what are you hiding? Why is this such a big deal to you? We should be able to talk about things openly, yada, yada, yada. And that can then put up more of a defense and more of a guarded approach to things, versus if you're like, yeah, totally get it, totally understand, and I take your lead in what you're comfortable responding to, and I can appreciate maybe you get a lot of these questions, so I want to be respectful of what you're wanting to share and not share, especially in the workplace.
When it comes to curiosity, if you are in a workplace and you suspect that somebody might be trans but they haven't told you,
Mm.
where does that come in with regards to sort of respecting people's privacy?
Yeah, yeah. People really struggle with that one because they want to be able to share with that person directly that they're supportive, right? Um, but then also realize, that person hasn't said anything. So who am I to kind of step into that? So they almost kind of freeze in that moment, or like, I don't know what to do.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and so in that case, it's really important to respect somebody's privacy. That if somebody wants to share that they're trans, if they are indeed trans, because sometimes people guess but actually are off, because we can't know who somebody is based on how they look. And so, if they are indeed trans and they don't want to share that, we want to respect that in the workplace. So, there are some people who never come out as trans. Perhaps they're still visibly trans, in that, we can we can kind of piece it together. But we want to not have that be in the mix if they don't want to share that. Um, Now, of course, you do still want to be supportive. And in order to do that, you can do that in a more indirect way. So, kind of signal more broadly that not directed at that person, but just to a wider audience, depending on what the situation is at work, to share positive articles about trans issues and how to resolve those in a workplace. Maybe you want to mention that there's Trans Day of Remembrance, which is usually in November, or Trans Day of Visibility, which is coming up in March. So there's ways that you can signal that you understand the issues, that you're wanting to work to support them. And so, with that type of understanding, maybe that person might be more comfortable share details about themselves if it's relevant. So there are ways to handle that situation without going beelining directly to them and being like, "What's up? Tell me all about yourself." I think you're trans, so let's no, it's just being able to provide a safe and supportive environment, and being kind of overt about that in many different ways can help that. And if people want to share more, they can, knowing that it's a safe place with either you specifically or with the broader team or the organization in general. So there's ways to navigate that in a respectful and responsive way.
Do you have any sort of closing comments or thoughts before we wrap up?
Absolutely. Yeah. I just want to emphasize that curiosity is not in of itself a bad thing. I think sometimes people, when we give these kind of tips and tools, they think, okay, I'm going to squash all my curiosity. It's more about thinking it in a thoughtful way of, maybe having a question, reflecting on that question, maybe even asking somebody else, hey, I'm thinking of asking this question. Is it invasive or is it genuine? Kind of talking it through. And then maybe you do ask the question of that trans person and they respond in some way and you can be responsive to that. Or you realize maybe it's not a question I want to ask to that person, but I still want the answer, and then go find some other resources. So there's ways to navigate it, but it's a little bit more dynamic and being attuned to the moment at hand to be able to know just how to get through it. So not trying to have us get rid of our curiosity, but just being more mindful about it.
If you have any questions that you want us to answer, or really Kai to answer, you can email us at podcast@transfocus.ca. And you can also find us on social media. Kai, where can they find you?
On LinkedIn, Instagram, Threads, Facebook, Blue Sky, and some others. Oh, TikTok. Yeah, it's a good one.
Great. So you can also send us a message or just tag us in a comment if you want us to answer any questions. But that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye for now.
Bye.